Sherri, it's great to be with you. Just want to talk with you a little bit and pick at your wisdom and experience, and then talk a little bit about how the brain science confirms the good stuff that you're doing. I want to start off by talking a little bit about your book, Rooted to Rise, which has been such a blessing to me. In fact, I have it here. And it really is full of brain science. And I don't know when you wrote it if you realize that, but all of us, our brain forms with different neural connections from an early age. And the associations we have with people and with events is what helps to make us who we are and make our brain the way it is. And so you have really given us some insight in this book into how your brain was formed and the different connections that have helped make you who you are. And I was thinking about that and just thinking about how all the different players we get to coach come with a book. They come with all these different life experiences that help shape who they are. And wouldn't it be good if you could read their book before you started coaching them?
Would it ever?
Yeah. And that's really one of the challenges, isn't it? To coach players, they're more than just physical athletes. So maybe talk about, for just a minute, if you would, some of the ways in which you have been able to identify traits in players or things that need developed in players, maybe even how you react to the different books they bring. Anything like that pops out to you and that we could talk about for a little bit?
Sure. I think as a college recruiter, one of the biggest indicators for us, where we got a lot of our information about the book that a player comes with, was through home visits. And I hated it that later in my career, those became less prevalent because of the early signing period. People made decisions, and therefore you didn't have those really informational time periods with kids. But what you found out in a home visit was how a young person interacts with their parents. It speaks a lot to their understanding of authority figures, their understanding of respect, their experience with unconditional love, the way the parent speaks to the young person. There are a lot of dynamics that go on inside of a home that simply by breaking bread and spending a meal with someone, you get some insights into what might be some raw spots and some hot spots and some underdeveloped areas and some value systems. And all of that becomes incredibly important when that student athlete arrives on your campus, and you're responsible not only for helping them grow, but also helping them perform at the maximum level. So it's motivation, it's understanding, it's navigation of that new life. And those things are critical for coaches to understand.
I've watched the wise coaches, the successful coaches, be able to adjust the way they coach different players. There's not one framework that works for every player.
Yeah, I used to say we treat them equally, but not the same. And that's because different players need different things. Many times have told at clinics as a high school coach. I had a kid, Stacy Hansmeyer, who was a great player, went on to play at the University of Connecticut. And I could yell at her in a way that I could never talk to someone else on the team, and not in a demeaning way, but in a very, you're better than that. You can do that. And if I had said that to maybe another player on the team, it would have crushed them and they wouldn't have been able to move forward. And so you have to learn how to talk to each one of those players in a way that they can hear you best. And typically there's a player in your gym, on your team, whether it's the field, the court, whatever it is, who can help you with that messaging. A strong, sometimes we name them captain, but a strong player who has good relationships. And by watching them as a coach, you can learn a lot about how to communicate with players on your team.
Maybe you could think about an experience where a player over time changed, and all of a sudden the way you had been able to motivate them, it wasn't the same. You think of any experiences like that?
Lots of experiences. The one that immediately popped into my head when you asked that question, recruited a point guard out of St. Louis, Deanna Jackson, who went on to be a great point guard for us and is now the head coach at UMKC. Just has had a remarkable career, was an assistant coach at Mississippi State and then at Texas. She's had a remarkable playing career and coaching career. But at Dee's home visit, I would say if she made eye contact once, it was for 2 seconds, and that's it. Everything was to the floor. She was very quiet. At the end of the home visit, I asked her if she had any questions, if there was anything at all. And she asked me one question: if she could wear her tall socks. She wore tall socks with stripes around the top, and nobody did that at that time. And I said, honey, if you come to Oklahoma, you can wear whatever kind of socks you want. It'll be fine. And that was it. That was the extent of our dialogue in her living room. Barbara and I, her mom and I, talked a lot. But this was this kid, this shy introvert who wanted to be herself and yet wanted to fit in and wanted to please. And the socks were kind of an extension of all that, a pretty passive one. But she came to Oklahoma and grew and grew. She was a freshman on our first Final Four team, and she was our sixth man. And those older guys did such a great job of just sort of giving her confidence a place to grow. They just kind of held her there and let her become who she was. By the time she was a senior, she led the gym. She controlled the games. She was in charge of issues in the locker room. She was always quiet in terms of she's not going to run in the room and everybody look at me, I'm here. But she said what needed to be said in a way that other people could hear it. And she became a very, very impactful leader, not just in our gym and on our team, but for our program and in future recruiting efforts. And it was an extrapolation of her growth over 4 years, just watching her get better and better and better and closer and closer and closer to the person that she wanted to be.
Yeah, that's great. And sometimes it goes the other way. Sometimes players will experience a negative event in their home or in their social life, and they bring that to the table or to the court as well. And as coaches, if we're all of a sudden they react in a way and we're like, what's going on? And sometimes it's getting behind that and seeing really what's happened as a part of that.
Oh, there's no question. We used to have bi-weekly meetings with all of our extended staff at the university. So that's nutrition, that's strength training, that's academic services, that's everything, every sports information, everybody who touched our players. And we did those for communicative purposes, obviously, so that all the hands knew what the other was doing. But the great benefit from that was we got information about our players. And so there might be a student athlete might be acting out with the academic advisor. She might be fighting her and she hadn't fought her in the past. And maybe we hadn't seen that on the court yet, but that would allow us to use our relationship to try to get to the root cause of that. Sometimes athletes would tell trainers things that they won't tell coaches or academic advisors or teachers. And our trainer could help us understand that something's going on outside the court. This is not exactly what it appears to be. And that kind of information helped us coach much better. I wish we'd have done it sooner. I wish we would have figured that out earlier instead of sometimes as coaches, we felt like we were trying to unravel something that we couldn't find the edges to. We knew something was going on, but we couldn't figure out what it was. And that's sometimes a very difficult thing to ascertain, especially if a kid is not willing to open up and be honest about it.
I was talking to a former college player recently, and he was telling me about an event in his life that the last person he wanted to tell was his coach, because that was what he cared about the most.
Yeah.
He cared about it not affecting his playing time, not affecting his relationship with his coach. And so he kept something secret from his coach where the coach would have helped him. But that's that value of that relationship, how much they value it. I think it's really interesting, Sherri. I've been thinking a lot about those neural connections that happen and the way kids are formed and the brains are formed, and then how that impacts the way we react. You mentioned something earlier about the ability to respond in a pressure situation, or the way your point guard, she got to where she could just control everything. And you used the term unconditional love, that you saw that in the home. Well, the kids that haven't experienced that unconditional love in parenting, all of a sudden they react to pressured situations differently, don't you think?
Oh, there's no question. Joe, I remember clearly, vividly, a preseason team meeting deep into my coaching career where we were going through our standards, our values, our mission, our ways of behavior. And I said almost in passing, before we even speak about any of these, we have to all understand and agree that we're operating from a foundation of unconditional love. And I just said it like that and went right on into the next thing. And I noticed at least three players on my team, you could see in their eyes that unconditional love didn't, and I had to rewind that, reel that in, and go about, first of all, the modeling. Our coaching staff had to model that, but the teaching of what that is, because it was a foreign concept to some of those kids. And all of those standards of behavior, that value system that I had outlined, really sat on nothing because they didn't understand that if they reached for one of those standards and missed, or if they ignored it and went the other way, we didn't stop loving them. They didn't understand that. They couldn't comprehend that because their value up until that point had been about what you can do. If you don't score 30 points, you're of no value to me. If you don't go get a college education, you're of no value to this family. If you don't, whatever. I mean, there's just a list of those things. And so rewinding that and talking about what it is and showing those student athletes what it looks like and what it feels like was incredibly important. But for a kid, if you can imagine, you make this shot, people love you. You miss this shot, people don't love you. The difficulty level of that shot goes through the roof. And if we don't, as coaches, I mean, you mentioned my book and my roots. I was raised with unconditional love all over the place. My immediate family, my teachers, my coaches, my church family. Those shots weren't that hard for me because if I missed them, everybody's going to love me just the same. So I have trouble feeling what that athlete feels, the pressure, the weight of that particular shot or play or outcome. And they have trouble understanding how I feel about it. And so bridging that is incredibly important and incredibly difficult for coaches.
Yeah, and you said that if you went more than 6 weeks without an individual meeting with a player, it became difficult for you to coach them. What that's talking about is that players are the product of things that are going on in their lives, not just what's going on the court. And good coaches are responding to those events, those things. And that includes the ability for someone to have the right zone that they're in to take that last shot, to want to experience that collectively as a team instead of it all being on me. And all of that is just fascinating to me. Talk a little bit more about what that means when you talk about those individual meetings and the difference of knowing a player versus not knowing them.
Well, you can't coach them well. You can't guide them to their best performances or to reach their maximum capacity if you don't know them. I think that's true in a business with leaders off the court. I think it's true in a family. If you're trying to raise your kids, if you don't really know who they are, it's really, really difficult to help them maximize their own gifts and become who they want to be. So I think that's true across the board. It's not just for coaching. But one of the things that I struggled with in having these individual meetings with players, especially late in my collegiate coaching career when NCAA guidelines became so tight that you could only spend a certain amount of time with kids. I really felt that closing in on me because that was when I felt like I did my best work, was when I spent individual time with them and got to know them so that I knew what buttons to push and how to motivate them and how to help them on the court. But it was so important to me that I kept a little secret calendar in my drawer because I felt like when you schedule relationship meetings, they become inorganic and you're like, this feels unnatural and maybe even insincere. And yet, if you don't keep track of it, life happens, time happens, and you talk to all those kids that are super easy to talk to and that are willing to come in your door and sit down on the couch and just start talking. And you look up and it's been 3 weeks and you've not had a one-on-one with that kid who probably needs it the most, but is the hardest to pin down and try to have that time with. And so I kept a little schedule, if you will, in my desk drawer where I would just write the date down when we had a one-on-one. And a one-on-one could be going to Sonic to get a slushie. It could be taking a walk around campus. I had one kid who I tried and tried and tried in my office, and I could get nothing. She shared nothing. One day I asked her if she'd like to go on a walk, and we went on a walk around campus and walking shoulder to shoulder with our eyes both forward. She told me all kinds of stuff. And we never tried to sit in my office again to talk. We had weekly walks and we went around campus, and it was awesome. And so there are lots of different ways. Sometimes you rebound for them. I mean, probably the best relationships I ever developed with players came with me just chasing the ball down and throwing it back to them and talking while we're doing it. But that's what enables you to not only motivate them for maximum performance, but to help them become who they want to become and navigate the fears and the challenges and the pressures of their lives, those things that we can't know about if we don't ask. And I think that's another subject entirely, but coaches need to ask a whole lot of questions.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. The simple brain science and also great common wisdom is players don't care what you know until they know that you care, right? And the brain actually responds differently to someone who you trust than it does to someone saying the same thing when you don't trust them. And so building those relationships, every coach knows it matters, but I think we tend to get in the rat race of a season and we forget how much that matters. And
It's the prioritization of it, for sure.
yeah,
For sure. You go to coaching clinics and everybody wants a hack. They want to play. They want the end of the game play, or they want an inbounds play that'll get them a bucket, or they want something specific, some little hack that helps them win a game. And if you go to a coaching clinic and you start talking to coaches about this stuff, they don't want to hear it. They want to walk out the door. And this is the stuff that gives you a chance to run the end of the gameplay to have a chance to win, because you're not going to even be in that position without this.
so let me pull on that for a second. So take an end of game pressure situation and you've got to play, but what are you saying in the huddle to address that other stuff, right? The confidence piece or take us into one of those huddles.
I always tried to orchestrate those end of game huddles when you had that this is a do or die situation with questions. Okay, who wants to make this pass? Who wants to make this pass? And we know who we want to
Yeah.
make that pass, and the players typically do too. But you want that kid to say, I want to make it. I want to make it. And then, all right, who wants to set the screen? Ooh, I do, I do, I do. And I can think of 3 games off the top of my head, one at Oklahoma State, one in Poughkeepsie, New York. I can think of 3 games off the top of my head where at the end of the game, I asked those questions. And I believe in my heart that because those players made the decisions about what they wanted to do, they worked. And again, we'd practiced it. They knew what to do. We all knew. I knew I wanted Amanda Thompson setting that screen, and I knew I wanted Naisha Stevenson to shoot that 3. But them deciding in the moment, and I said, I want it. I want that shot. Perfect. Now she has given herself the confidence, because I truly believe that that's where it comes from. You give it to yourself. And so as coaches, we set up the environment. We create the stage for those players to choose that confidence. And I think that's what those late game timeouts are about, setting the stage so that they can make those decisions.
That's awesome. We talk about the difference of achievement goals versus avoidance goals. And what you've done by asking those questions is you put the player in a mindset of, hey, this is something I want to achieve. This is something I want to accomplish, rather than I'm afraid to fail. And so by your questioning, you're putting the brain, really their brains, in a better framework. And the other aspect that we talk about is there's a power differential between the coach and a player that's a good thing. And yet there's real value in sharing the team experience, right? That she's not making that shot for you as the coach, but for us. And there's that ownership that's a whole different kind of experience. And interestingly enough, the brain is made for that kind of connection, and it operates best in that what we call the brotherhood or the sisterhood, the team concept, the family concept. It operates better in that environment than it does the solo. We've all seen athletes that just try to put their team on their back and be the star, and sometimes that works, but that's not as healthy of a place as, hey, we're doing this together.
No question. No question. The strength and the buoyancy from that brotherhood or sisterhood elevates what you already have inside.
Yeah, that's great. How are some ways that you help players handle pressure situations? not everybody's innately good at it. So, what are some ways that you try to help develop that?
Well, I think you give them as many as you possibly can. You make it a customary thing. Like it's like running to the other end of the floor and back. So every day in practice, you create as many pressure situations as you possibly can in as many different ways, about as many different things. Some of them are really important. You win that. I say really important. You win this game if you make the shot. Some of them don't have as much weight as that, but I think you just vary that and you throw those things out because confidence comes from demonstrated ability. The more confidence you have, the less pressure you feel. The more times you face pressure and handle it, the more confident you are. So you're giving them a chance to demonstrate that ability over and over and over. And there's this really safe place to fail. You don't make the free throw and everybody's got to run a sprint. Okay, nobody dies. Everything's good. It's okay. We move right on, and then you face it the next time. But I think we make a mistake when we try to protect kids from all that, and then there is a pressure situation, and suddenly they don't know what to do with it,
Yeah,
which is sort of a soapbox I jump on about the importance of athletics because it's giving kids this opportunity to handle hard things before it really matters. Because it really doesn't matter in a basketball game or a football game or a tennis match. It really doesn't matter in the great scheme of things. It's a game. But the skills that they develop from handling those hard things in the games will matter in life beyond the lines. And so it's important to expose them to things so that they can demonstrate their ability to handle it.
you're building resilience in their life. You're creating predictable, moderate doses of stress that builds that resilience, as opposed to just putting them into an environment where it's overwhelming. And that's one of the great things, you're right, about sports. That a lot of the trauma experts talk about how those experiences of predictable, moderate, limited doses of stress are what builds the resilience and allows kids to grow out of trauma into resilience. I'm with you on the sports side. That's really interesting. What about the mindset of being a favorite versus being an underdog? How does that impact the way we coach?
So funny that you asked that right now. We're on the heels of the US Open, and one of the American hopefuls, Tommy Paul, I was watching him play throughout the tournament, and he played so well up into the quarters, I think. And when he was behind, he was unbelievable. But every time he got ahead, he just sort of crumbled. And I just kept saying, you got to play with the lead, dude. You got to be able to play with the lead. And it is a completely different skill set, I think. I think there are a couple of things that happen when you're the favorite or you're ahead. And number one is you can not prepare as much as you should have. You can get distracted. You cannot take the care and the attention and the focus that you might apply when you're behind. But the other piece of that is you can feel all of the pressure, all of the self imposed, typically, pressure from what expectations are around you. And you can try too hard and you can squeeze too tight and you can think too much. And so it can go one of either way. I think when you're coming from behind or you're playing without those expectations to win, you get an opportunity to maybe focus more on exactly what it is and not so much on the external entrapments. And when you're expected to win or you're ahead, then you start to think about all of these outside noises and outside factors, and it can get in the way of your performance. And each requires a very different skill set.
Yeah, so again, a couple of practical tips for when you're the favorite team.
First of all, we would always talk about how no one else's opinion of us mattered nearly as much as our opinion of ourselves. We would begin right there. Have we done the work? Are we prepared? Do we know what the game plan is? Is everybody on the same page? Do we know why we're playing? And when those things lined up, then they sort of cancel out
So that's
those,
really going back to your goals, right? And your
yeah,
whys.
yeah, our who we want to be.
Okay.
That was always way more important for us than what we wanted to do, because who we wanted to be drove the what we wanted to do. Clearly, we were going to do the right things in practice to develop the skills that were necessary to be champions. But there's so much human stuff that connects all those things that are required strategically or fundamentally or technically to be a champion. And so if you can focus on that, the who of it, and I always say, Simon Sinek is it starts with why guy, but I've never seen a why that's not connected to a who. And so if we can go back to that individually and collectively about who we want to be as a group together, then some of those things that you can squeeze too tight on and think too much about just minimize. They just fall into the backdrop because you're trying to behave in a certain way.
Obviously, by the time a player gets to the University of Oklahoma, they've got some resilience in their life. They've accomplished a lot of things. But those same traits are true. I was thinking, I went to my granddaughter's middle school volleyball game, and they're a brand new team and have some talent. And they would get behind and they would battle back and they would get ahead and then they would crumble, right? Because they just they don't know how to win. They don't know how to feel when there's pressure. They don't know how to respond to that. And you're saying like the key is to go back to who we are, who our identity is. And a lot of times, Sherri, that has to happen outside of me, right? It's somebody reminding me of that. We talk about how in the midst of, if I'm dysregulated, it's important for me to regulate, but it's a lot easier if someone comes alongside and co-regulates me. So if you have a teammate, a player that begins to get out of control or begins to get overly stressed, it's probably best for a teammate to come alongside of them, obviously a coach, but someone else has got to help them to regulate back as
Yeah,
well.
I think that's why the environment, the air is what we called it, of a locker room is so important. If the air can be the same, regardless of what's at stake, then that regulation, to use your word, Joe, that regulation happens more quickly and with less resistance in the moment because there is that, it's sort of been raised in this temperature. And I think that's where teammates become so important. Maybe even to a certain extent more than coaches. Of course, coaches can escalate a situation. We can convince a team that they can't win. We can take a mediocre situation and turn it into a horrible one. There are lots of things coaches can do that are not helpful. But the power of teammates is incredibly impactful. I've watched teammates override coaches because of the environment that they create among themselves and how they link themselves together with that consistent expectation.
Yeah, that's great, Sherri. One of the things I'm trying to get across to coaches is the value of doing that proactively instead of just reactively. So on the front end, to teach players how to be regulated, to give them regulation strategies, to have the air of the locker room being a co-regulating, hey, we're going to help one another, keep our minds open for business. We talk about how the brain actually shrinks, the smart brain actually shrinks when we get traumatized. And when a player gets exhausted, they're going to have trouble thinking, they're going to make mistakes. If a player gets distracted by the refs, they're going to make mistakes. There are all kinds of things like that create the tension that make us less effective. And what we're saying is the good coaches are addressing those things on the front end, not
Well, I
just.
think you teach responses just like you teach pivots and left hand flick passes and how to block out. I used to ask our guys, what happens a lot in the game of basketball? And invariably they would say, shooting. No, it doesn't. It doesn't happen a lot. How many times might you shoot in a game? 6, 7 at the most. And then they would say dribbling. No, no, that's not a good thing either, unless it's the point guard typically. Passing, no, that's a lost art. We go through all the things. And I would say, what happens a lot in basketball is you run down here, and then you turn around and you run down there, and then you turn around and you run back down there. And if you can get really, really good at that, then we have a chance to be successful. But you know what else happens a lot? A whole bunch of stuff that you wish didn't. Like your teammate shoots an air ball, or you get called for a moving screen, or the other team banks in a shot at halftime. All these things happen consistently, things that you didn't plan for and you didn't want. And if you can learn how to respond to those, if you can get good at responses, then we have a great chance to be successful because it's going to happen a lot. And the team who's the best at the things that happen the most is going to win. And so as coaches, you train those responses. And what does that look like? It looks like body language. Never going like this when a ref makes a call that you disagree with, never looking the other way and rolling your eyes when a teammate gives you a bad pass that went out of bounds. And you can't just not do those things. I think that sometimes as coaches where we make our mistake, we have to give players something to do in place of those things,
That's
because the
good.
mind doesn't work that way. It's like, don't eat, don't eat, don't eat. Your mind here's eat. And so you give them something to do. And we would tell our players to sprint to the guy who just fell down on the floor and help them up. We had a touch rule. We had a positive body language that we went through that was just as specific as our start, stops, and turns lines. I mean, those things mattered, and you teach those, you reinforce those as coaches in practice and in games, and players learn how to respond better.
Yeah, you can get a playbook off the internet. You can't get what you're talking about off the internet. That comes from the sages, the experience, and coaches recognizing there's more to this game than just the X's and O's.
And it's hard because it's an all the time thing. You can't say it at a preseason meeting and then not reinforce it every single day in practice, every single drill of every single day in practice, because that's where the muscle memory takes over. The mind and the body takes over because of those repetitions. That's what makes it hard.
Yeah, and that response, there actually is a part of the brain that operates where that repetitive muscle memory works. And in that, if that's not trained, then when those experiences happen, it's going to run somewhere else. And if we have trained that experience, then when my teammate shoots an air ball that looks ridiculous, I'm going to respond by that trained experience because I've got those neural reactions. Just I love it.
We all have a strong and weak voice that we carry around in our head. And it doesn't matter how much we've done, it doesn't matter how many championships we've won, how much success we've had. We all have that strong voice that says, you got this, you can do this, you've been here a million times. And that weak voice that says, can you really, who do you think you are? What makes you think you could do this? And we have to learn, all of us, not to make that weak voice disappear. I don't think that's possible, but we learn to hear it and make the choice to replace it with the strong voice. And it's that replacement that really makes the difference. And typically you learn how to do that by both a physical and a verbal mantra. You say something and you do something, and it'll just shift your body. The mind's an amazing machine in that way. And when you give it that cue, it'll just shift from weak to strong.
That's good. And that plasticity, that ability for the mind to reshape and reform is really key for kids coming out of trauma. As if they've experienced negative responses to adversity and people quitting on them when they make a mistake. And so you're rewiring all that in the way that you're coaching. I want to finish with this, Sherri, if I can. I want to maybe a little harder, a little deeper, but I want you to talk about a player or players, not by name, but that experience some anxiety, depression, maybe a serious domestic violence issue in their home, or something that was really challenging that you as a coach had to walk through with.
Gosh, so many players come to mind, because unfortunately that's more the norm than the exception. But I think of one particular player who had experienced great loss in her life before she came to play for us. And because of that void, her inability to get what she needed from that situation, everything became like life or death. Every encounter felt like life or death. Every drill felt like life or death. Every shot felt like life or death. And the bigger the stage, the greater that pressure, the greater that pull. And we had to unravel that. And what that meant was, for a while, performance was worse, not better. It was a lot worse. She actually looked like a shell of the player that she ultimately was. And that created all sorts of external criticism of her and us and all of those things. But we knew the healing that had to take place so that when her basketball career was over, she could function the way she needed and wanted to function. And she built that back and played well down the stretch, but didn't go on to have a professional career that the kind that she had envisioned and dreamed about. But she's so healthy today. And as painful as that was during the time, because I really, there was a part of me, and that I'm embarrassed to say this and ashamed to say this, but I thought I can just leave this alone and she's going to be pretty good and we're going to win a whole bunch more. Or I can open this thing up and she's not going to play very well for a while and our team is going to suffer. And we did. And there were times where I thought, oh, but I know it was the right thing to do. It was a very difficult decision at the time, though. Easy now to look back on and say, yeah, but those are calls you have to make sometimes. And I think that's part of what coaches have to understand is that it's not always like, okay, I want you to talk to me about what's going on in your life or whatever. And they do. And then they're going to go out and they're going to play great the next day. That's not the way that works. Sometimes, yeah, they need a place to lay it and then they can go play free. But mostly it's a long, arduous road that requires a lot of commitment on your behalf and the player's behalf to sort of unravel those things and put them back together in a way that's healthier.
And so what we talk about, you have to have goals and then pathways and then the why, the willpower to do it. And as a coach, to make a decision like that, you have to go back to your why. And your why is not just winning, it's letting them reach their full potential, your players. And so I think as coaches, the ability to really identify for us why we're doing what we're doing and going back and checking that in our decision making is really key.
And Joe, the hard part about that, and I don't know that anybody who hasn't blown the whistle or roamed the sideline can really understand this. Intellectually, I don't think there are a lot of coaches that don't know that. I mean, intellectually, like, and they could tell you their why. And, what's hard is living by it every single day with the noise of the world around you. It is so hard. And so coaches need one another. They need a foxhole coach. Shaka Smart is a friend of mine. He has a coach who is his safe place, who is his truth teller, who is this person that can keep him closely connected to his why. And they talk constantly because it doesn't take long to get off of it. And before you know it, you've spun out into left field and it's really, really hard to get back then. So I say that with great compassion for coaches who are trying to do the right thing in the right ways and their why is pure. It's so easy to get pulled out of orbit. And so find yourself a buddy or a little foxhole group, a tribe where you can stay connected to that and hold one another accountable, because you need support every bit as much as your players need your support. And we all have to keep our cup full. And so I think those relationships are incredibly important for coaches to have now more than ever because of the noise of the world.
That's dead on. We need people that are going to tell us the truth. We make mistakes by making decisions where we give ourselves a pass and then another pass, and before long we've spun away from what we really want our board to be about. So that's really, really valuable. Thank you for your time. You've become a hero to me, and really thankful for what you're doing.
Well, I appreciate the work that you do. And you're right. I had zero idea that there was any brain science behind my book. But it's good to know that there is, maybe.
It's full of it. It's full of it. And a great read. I hope everyone will read it.